Hello everybody, my name is Happy, and I'd like to welcome you back to my history reaction channel for part 5 of The Great Northern War by Kings and Generals. This episode is subtitled The Battle of Gadebusch. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce that, but I think that's close, in 1712. Now obviously this is going to cover a lot more than just the one battle, but that's what they call this episode, so that's what we're going to go with. Anyway, this has been an interesting ride. As always, Kings and Generals does an incredibly good job at getting down into the details, so I've been trying to add what I can where I can, but that's been pretty limited just because I'm not a military historian, and while I know the broad strokes of this war, this video is getting into much more detail than I myself am generally aware of. So I will add what I can where I can, but a lot of this I'm just going to be learning alongside you guys. That's just the reality of it. And that is because Kings and Generals does such a good job. So please consider showing them some support. As always, a link to the original content will be down in the description below. With that said, let's just go ahead and get into this. I will add what I can.
The Battle of Poltava marked the turning point in the Great Northern War.
Big time.
The Swedes, who were on the offensive for the majority of the last decade, were left with the difficult task of defending their empire without their elite army. The Russians, finally out from the shadow of their earlier defeats, were at liberty to attack in all directions without the worry of a powerful opposing army. The rest of Sweden's enemies would not sit idle at this opportunity either. The conflict was far from over, and although Sweden's military might was crippled, they would not go down without a fight.
That's an understatement. We're still talking about King Charles XII. That guy does not understand the meaning of the word quit while you're ahead, the phrase quit while you're ahead, or the word quit. He's going to keep going. He's not going to give up. Nothing if not tenacious. He is very much part of our cult of offensive, attack, attack, attack. He is tactically brilliant, but not necessarily the best long-term strategist. Peter's much better at that, and this is kind of the point in the war where we're going to see the strategy overtaking the tactical brilliance of Charles, because you only need one catastrophic loss to really put you in a bad position. If you're the kind of guy who can learn from your mistakes, step back, recoup, plan, and improve, then you might still have a chance. If you're the kind of guy who gets his backside handed to him and you get right back up and go in swinging again without learning from your mistakes, you're going to be in trouble. And adding to this, Charles has made a lot of enemies during this war. The Saxons, the Danes over in Denmark, various factions in the Polish-Lithuanian complex, and others. This whole thing started because Sweden had taken land from a bunch of different countries, and a lot of these other allies of Russia have been knocked out of the war. But if they see Charles II or Charles XII take a huge hit, they're going to be considering jumping back in again. And the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, you still have, I always want to say complex for some reason. So if I slip up and say complex, forgive me, I don't know why I'm doing that. Well, it's a complicated country, that's why. But the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, I almost did it again, had been in a state of basically civil war. Their old king, elected king, Augustus II, was knocked out of the fight by Charles XII, but he's not out of the picture. Again, if he sees that Charles had been weakened, he might try to take his position back in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from, Stanislav. So there's so much going on here. We're going to see some of these people who've been pushed out of the fight coming back in. The Ottomans are going to get involved in the rest of the war, or at least in the next phase of the war. I don't think they get involved very long, but they do get involved. So the entire nature of the war is changing, and the balance of power is shifting tremendously. A couple of great empires are on the verge of falling apart. That would be Sweden, the Swedish Empire, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And a new one is rising, the Russian Empire. it had been just kind of on the fringes up until this point. But thanks to this war, thanks to Peter the Great's reforms, his willingness to embrace Western ideas, Western philosophies, Western technologies, he's one of the rare czars that actually willingly, eagerly looks to the West and wants to learn from them and get the best ideas that he can from them. Most of the other czars are going to be traditionalists. They're going to be very conservative. The old ways are the better ways. There are exceptions, and Peter's definitely one of those. He is kind of guy who's always eager to learn more about anything, but especially about military things. So he's constantly improving during this war. He's constantly learning. Charles XII is tactically brilliant, but he's not learning. He's just being Charles XII. So let's see where this goes. I've rambled enough. I'm probably just trying to get all this out right now because I don't know that I'm going to be able to contribute much once we get into this.
Peter's reforms changed Russia.
The beard tax, yes.
Militarily, socially, and economically, while the reforms proposed by the sponsor of this video, Manscaped, are...
Alright, we are going to skip the sponsor. I always do that on the older videos. On anything that's relatively new, we will look at the sponsor. So, I'll see you on the other side. We're back.
Peter left Poltava for Kiev shortly after the surrender of the Swedish army at Perivolochna. Once there, he sent letters throughout the continent, describing the details of the battle and his complete victory.
Of course he did. That's a brilliant move on Peter's part. Let all the participants know that Charles XII has been defeated. He's not out of it yet, but it's a massive defeat. He's lost a significant part of his elite army. That's going to intimidate the people who are allied with Charles. And hopefully it's going to bring folks like Augustus II in Saxony and Denmark and some of these other former players back into the game. But also, it's just a good morale push for Russia, bad morale for Sweden and its allies. And Peter's main goal in this early stage after the victory is going to be to regain his allies and gain new ones. He is going to get as many people as he can on his side. He's also going to really focus heavily back up here on the Baltic. He is proud of his new city at Petersburg. He is going to try to secure as much land around Petersburg and as much access to the Baltic as he can, because first and foremost, he wants Petersburg to be safe, well secure from the borders of potentially rival countries, but he also wants his access to the Baltic to be secure. So that's going to become an immediate priority for him, but also getting allies and lowering the morale of Sweden's allies, trying to improve his situation.
Europe was left in complete shock. Until that moment, they had only received news of continuous Swedish victories. The Duke of Marlborough famously wrote, "We have no confirmation as yet of the battle between the Swedes and the Muscovites, but should it be true of the first being so entirely beaten as is reported, what a melancholy reflection it is that after constant success for 10 years, Charles XII should in 2 hours' mismanagement and ill success ruin himself and his country."
And that's something that we haven't discussed before, but I should probably bring it up here. You notice he describes the Russians as the Muscovites. So for most of, for example, the 17th century, it's not the Russian Empire. You're still looking at Muscovy, and that's what a lot of Europe still sees that part of the country, or that part of the world as. They don't see them as being a Russian Empire, but they see them as the Muscovites. Sometimes it's the Duchy of Muscovy, other times it's the Principality of Muscovy. That depends on how you translate the Russian equivalent terms. Countries where principalities are hereditary tend to go with the Duchy. Other countries might go with Principality. If you look at the historiography of this, you will see that prior to well into the 19th century, Duchy was preferred, but in later years, historians have largely switched to principalities when describing these Russian states at this period. And so, yeah, for most of Europe, these guys are going to be not Russia, but the Muscovites from Muscovy.
The rest of Europe's elite had a similar disposition towards the Russian victory. However, some welcomed Russia onto the European stage. The famous polymath and philosopher Leibniz remarked that Peter would now be the Turk of the North.
I don't think Peter would take that as a compliment, given his constant fighting with the Ottomans.
Charles himself only avoided capture by sacrificing the majority of his elite army and his most trusted commanders. Though Russian forces pursued the Swedish king, they could not catch him before he crossed the Bug and entered Ottoman territory.
The Bug, I love the name of that river.
Sultan Ahmed III prepared a camp for Charles and his followers at Bender, and they would settle there for the time being.
Yeah, and that's gonna get Peter in trouble because he's gonna demand Charles back, or that Charles be extradited. And he's gonna be so pushy about it that he's gonna get the Ottomans mad at him.
Peter was elated because of his grand victory, yet he was also equally disappointed due to Charles and Mazeppa's escape into Ottoman lands. Wasting no time, the Tsar entered diplomatic talks with Augustus of Saxony, Frederick of Denmark, Frederick William of Prussia, and George I of Hanover.
Of course
The
he
victorious Russian army was subsequently split in two. Sheremetev would move north towards the Baltic, while Menshikov would advance west into Poland. Stanisław, whose position in Poland was already negligible, saw his royal authority erode completely after the defeat of the Karolian army. Augustus repudiated the Treaty of Altenstadt and advanced into Poland with an army. The magnates of the Commonwealth, either out of dislike towards Stanisław or fear of Russian aggression, began endearing themselves to their former monarch and offered him the crown once again. Left without any alternative, Stanisław joined the Swedish forces in their retreat to Pomerania and then abdicated. To compensate him for the lost crown, Charles granted him the Principality of Zweibrücken and named him Count Palatine. King once again, Augustus met Peter on the 9th of October at Turin. He feared Peter's reaction to having been abandoned in 1706. However, the Tsar did not hold a grudge.
Yeah. I love this story. I don't know if it's true or if it's apocryphal. It sounds apocryphal, but given Peter's character, I can honestly believe that it's true too. If anybody knows for sure, feel free to share it in the comments.
Nevertheless, at dinner, Peter could not resist an ironic thrust at Augustus's faithlessness. "I always wear the cutlass you gave me," Peter said, "but it seems you do not care for the sword I gave you, as I see you are not wearing it." Augustus replied that he prized Peter's gift, but that somehow in the haste of his departure from Dresden, he had left it behind. Said Peter, "Then let me give you another." He gave Augustus the same sword he had given him before, which had been discovered in Charles's baggage as the monarch signed
Quite the message he's sending there.
a new treaty that effectively made the Commonwealth a Russian dependency in all but name. The Russians were allowed to station their troops in the Commonwealth. Peter would become the guarantor of the rights of the Polish nobility, while Augustus would join all of Peter's wars. One secret clause of the treaty was that Augustus would be allowed to claim Livonia. In the following days, Peter also established alliances with the Danes and the Prussians, who would enter the war again by the end of 1709. A large Danish army landed in Scania at the beginning of 1710. Alarmed at the prospect of an attack on mainland Sweden, a 15,000-strong army was raised by Magnus Stenbock. At the Battle of Helsingborg in March, the Swedish army decisively defeated their Danish counterpart. This effectively marked the last time that the Danish tried to reclaim Scania.
Yeah, so attacking the Swedes at home is still not a good idea.
As Augustus was consolidating his power in the Commonwealth for most of 1710, and the Danish were rebuilding their armies at the same time, the western front of the war went through a lull for most of the year. The same cannot be said for the eastern Baltic, though. Sweden's Baltic ports remained relatively undefended now that the Karolian army had capitulated.
Peter's gonna go
In
right
July,
after-
Riga, Sweden's richest and most populous city, surrendered to the Russians after negotiating the restorations of old privileges for the Livonian nobility. According to the Treaty of Turin, Riga was supposed to be handed over to Augustus. However, the topic seemingly never resurfaced again. Dunemunda and Pernau fell in August, while Arensberg and Revel capitulated in September. In March of the same year, Viborg had been besieged too. Suffering from a lack of supplies and artillery, the Russian army was unable to assault the well-defended fortress. Finally, after several months, Peter arrived with his new fleet, bringing his army much-needed food and weapons. The massive Russian artillery barrages breached the walls within a few days, and the Swedish garrison quickly surrendered. With this, Peter had finally achieved one of his main personal goals, to form a powerful defensive corridor around his capital, St. Petersburg.
Right.
The Russian
Yeah, that's a big deal for him because, A, that city's very important to him, but also because it's got a good port. He really desperately wants as much access to the oceans as he can get. And this is a good one. It gives him great access to all the Baltic states, but also the rest of Western Europe.
Russians led several offensives into Finland during the next 2 years. However, due to logistical issues, they were unsuccessful. No sooner had Charles taken refuge in the Ottoman Empire, Peter had begun sending letters to the Sultan, requesting the Swedish king's extradition. These letters became increasingly threatening as the months passed, much to the annoyance of Ahmed. Taking the last of Peter's letters as a personal insult, the Sultan declared war on Russia in October of 1710.
That's not good.
The Tsar was still under the impression of his victory at Poltava, and this prompted him to enter the war with a much smaller army than the Ottoman one, relying only on the support of Moldavia and Wallachia. This war, known as the Pruth Campaign, ended in a swift defeat for the Russians, with Peter himself only avoiding being captured due to the incompetence of the Ottoman Grand Vizier. The subsequent Pruth Treaty stipulated, among other things, that Peter would allow Charles free passage to Sweden. Charles would not use that right, however, instead choosing to remain in the Ottoman Empire to try and persuade the Sultan to attack Russia again.
Not a bad move for Charles. He doesn't really make a lot of good moves in the diplomatic department. He tends to be a little too arrogant and obstinate for that, but in this case, that's a good move with him. Try to get the Sultan to join the war on his side.
In 1711, the Allied forces began a massive offensive into Swedish Pomerania, besieging the fortresses of Stralsund, Stettin, and Wismar. But since the armies were more interested in raiding the countryside, the sieges were not effective. Additionally, disagreements between the commanders and a lack of siege artillery ensured that nothing of note would be achieved. In September, Stenbock landed on the island of Rügen with a large army. Alarmed at the prospect of facing a strong Swedish army, the Allied forces retreated from Stralsund and Stettin. As the Allies were insufficiently strong to take such well-garrisoned cities, they remained content with sporadic raids on smaller settlements. In the spring of 1712, another strong Swedish army arrived in Stralsund. Consequently, the Danish navy began tightening its grip over the Baltic Sea, which worsened the situation for the defenders of the Swedish forts.
And that also makes sense. The Danes haven't had a lot of luck on ground fighting, but they've got a great navy. What they can't do with their ground forts is they can probably do pretty well with their ships. Sweden's got a great navy too, but this is going to make life difficult for the Swedes getting resupply and reinforcements over to where the fighting's taking place if the Danes can interfere in the Baltic.
Stenbock knew that Stralsund would not survive a combined land and sea-based blockade. However, facing the combined Danish, Saxon, Russian army was not a feasible option either. In autumn, the Allied forces split up into two, so that one part could raid Mecklenburg. Stenbock's options were now to face a large Russian-Saxon army south of Stralsund, or to head west into Mecklenburg and fight the Danish. In the end, he decided on the latter option. Peter was in Dresden at the time, recovering from an illness. He was already furious because of the lack of coordination between the Allied commanders, and after hearing of Stenbock advancing towards Mecklenburg, he ordered his forces to engage in a pursuit without him.
Good idea. These guys haven't learned the same lesson Peter's learned it. You need superior numbers to beat these Swedes. Even then, it's dicey at times, most of the time so far. Dividing your forces, that was a huge mistake, given who you're fighting.
Stenbock advanced quickly, much faster than the Russian-Saxon armies did. On the 3rd of December, the Danish army encamped for winter quarters southwest of Wismar, near the town of Gadebusch. The Swedish army arrived at Wernau on the 14th, and by the 18th they were already at Brusewitz, merely 10 kilometers away from the Danish army. At that point, the Russian army was south of Lake Schwerin and could not provide any assistance. Only a small Saxon cavalry detachment arrived to aid the Danish by the eve of the battle. Stenbock knew that any delay would be detrimental to his cause.
Yeah, so again, the Swedes tactically know what they're doing quite well. You've got an army in front of you that's been separated. You got one coming in from behind, but they're not here yet. If you can take one out, then you're in before the other gets there. Your chances are much greater. If you try to defend, if you try to dig in, you're in trouble, because then you're going to have armies on both sides of you.
So he marched his army through a snowstorm, arriving on the other side of the river on the morning of the 20th. Jobst von Scholtens, the leader of the Danish army, placed his forces behind a river and dense marshland near the village of Falkenstedt. The strong Danish defensive position made their leaders believe that the Swedes would turn south and try to cross the river at a safer point before attacking. After reconnaissance, however, Stenbock concluded that their only chance of victory would be through a full frontal assault. The Allied army was around 17,000 strong, with 8,000 Danish infantrymen, 5,000 cavalry, along with another 4,000 Saxon horsemen. The Swedish army had about 12,500 men, with 6,500 footmen and 6,000 cavalry.
Okay, my money's on the Swedes here, because they're up against superior numbers, but not by a lot, and they've won much better victories against much worse odds before.
Both sides placed their infantry in the center and their cavalry on the flanks. The Swedes had 30 cannons, while the Danish had 14.
Okay, definitely on the Swedes in that case, because that really tilts it in their advantage. They already kind of had one because they win all these fights like
Jobst
this.
von Scholten led the Danish army, Jakob von Flemming led the cavalry on the left flank. Stenbock led the Swedish army. At 1 p.m, the Swedish artillery opened fire, and the rest of their troops advanced. The Swedes were using a new type of cannon, which was more mobile and precise than the Danish artillery. Their artillery barrage not only managed to cover the advance of their troops, but also dealt heavy casualties to the Danish forces. The Swedish infantry advanced towards the Danish position through a narrow clearing. Adhering to the Karolian tactics, they advanced until they could discern their enemy's facial features and fired several devastating volleys. The Danish infantry returned fire, however it was not precise.
Yeah, Swedes are much more skilled overall at this time than the foes they're facing. They're more disciplined. They know not to waste their shots. They've got, in this case, superior artillery. That's going to make a huge difference. This fight, I don't know anything about this battle, but I can already tell you the Swedes are going to win this one. Of course, I'm kind of also basing that on the fact that these guys shouldn't have left off on their own in the first place. That tells me that they're not the brightest commanders. That was just a really, really foolish move.
Scholtens attempted to break the Swedish center with a cavalry attack from the right. This attack failed due to precise Swedish volleys, as well as artillery barrages, and the cavalry retreated after suffering significant casualties. Afterwards, the Swedish left attacked the winded Danish right. This forced Scholten to wheel his entire army to the left to avoid being outflanked. Simultaneously, the Swedish cavalry on the right managed to find a small path through the marsh and attacked. The Danish left was caught completely by surprise and began retreating because of the relay.
So now, by doing what they did to protect on the one side, they've really left themselves wider open on the other side. This is gonna go badly for them. See that already.
Relentless Swedish assault. The Allied army, though in a strong defensive position, was suffering from disorganization. Flemming, the leader of the Danish forces on the left, requested that the cavalry which was kept behind Falkenstedt be brought to the front on the morning of the battle. Scholten acquiesced, however his order came in late, and those cavalry regiments were caught behind the Danish left during the retreat. As they were unprepared for battle and caught in a position where maneuvering was difficult, disorder broke loose within their ranks. They were pushed back to Falkenstedt, where brutal fighting ensued. The quick and precise Swedish assault along the entire front pushed the Danish army back and some units began routing. Unable to save their left flank, Fleming and Skultens retreated behind Werkenstedt and formed a new defensive line there. The Swedish left once again assaulted the Danish right. However, they were fired upon by the Danish Royal Guard and lost some of their momentum. Nevertheless, the Danish right almost broke, and Fleming had to reinforce it with his Saxon cavalry. The Saxons managed to stabilize the line. However, their attempts to push the Swedes back were unsuccessful. The Royal Guard still continued firing at the Swedish cavalry, causing many casualties. This forced Stenbock to send his elite infantry regiments to fight them, and the two sides engaged in a brutal melee. This engagement was eventually won by the Swedes, and the Danish centre began to retreat. The Saxons, though unable to defeat the Swedish left, fought fiercely and ensured that their enemies could not pursue the retreating forces. Most of the troops on the Danish left were either killed or captured, and only a few soldiers managed to retreat with the rest of the army. In the end, the Danish army lost all of their artillery and about 6,000.
Not good. You need that artillery in this time.
500 men, most of whom were captured, while the Swedes lost 1,500. Although this battle was a tactical success for Stenbock's army, it proved to be strategically insignificant.
And that's a big deal. And that's the real problem with Sweden during this war is they're great at the tactical victories, but too many of their fights have no good long-term strategic value, especially at this point in the war. That's going to really come back to bite them in the backside.
The Danish army was not completely broken, and the Russians and Saxons still had overwhelming numerical superiority. Furthermore, the Swedish army was no longer within the safety of Stralsund's walls, and marching back would be a risky move. A lack of supplies also began to take its toll on them, and to make matters worse, the Baltic Sea was still frozen, so resupplying by ship was not an option.
And that's why even though Russia's fought hard for Baltic access, and they've had it for a long time, as well as their access to the White Sea up by Arkhangelsk and other places up there, they've also always been looking for other warm water ports because the Baltic is shut down for 4 to 6 months out of the year. The White Sea ports are shut down at least half of the year. They need other ports if they want to have a naval presence, if they want to have a good commercial presence in the sea lanes.
Stenbock subsequently moved west with his army, trying to extort funds and supplies out of the Danish-controlled city of Altona. When the citizens failed to meet the overwhelming demands, the Swedish army burned the city to the ground.
Jeez.
The army headed east afterwards. However, it was surrounded by a large Russian-Saxon force nearby Turning. Breaking his neutrality, Charles Frederick of Holstein-Gottorp provided refuge to the Swedish army inside his fort. As with the Spanish War of Succession nearly over, the Duke expected aid from Great Britain and the United Provinces, just like in 1700. Their ships never arrived, and with hunger and disease running rampant throughout his army, Stenbock surrendered on the 13th of May.
Yeah, we mentioned this previously, but the Spanish War of Succession is going on at the same time, so that's got the rest of Europe pretty tied up. So that's one big reason why they're not involved much. Yeah, let's just keep going.
Having lost another army, Charles seems to be in dire straits, with defeat being an increasingly realistic option. The Allied powers were more than willing to make peace with Sweden. Charles, adamant that he would not relinquish even an inch of land, refused even the most lenient offers.
Stubborn.
With the king so headstrong and averse to defeat, it became evident that war-weary Sweden would not sue for peace, at least not while Charles XII was still breathing. Our next episode will see the conclusion of the Great Northern War, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely.
Absolutely, yes. Support these guys. They work hard at this. It's very obvious they work hard at this. We want to show them our support. Anyway, that was the penultimate episode. We will be concluding this series tomorrow, as well as our Atomic Age and Nuclear Accident series. And then we will be going into Oversimplified Cold War, followed by several days of just this and that, kind of shake things up a little, give everybody a breather from these long series, and then we'll take something else off of our request list. If you're new here, I do take requests. If you've got a video you'd like me to look at, or even just a general topic you'd like me to find something on, please consider leaving me a note in the comments. The channel's still small enough that I will keep a list of every single request I get, and I will try to do something for everybody that makes a request. I'm not going to promise I'll make every single request. If somebody gives me 10 requests, I may not get to all of that person's requests, but all the requests I'm getting right now, I will absolutely do my best to make sure I get at least one from each person, and as many of them overall as I can. The channel has started growing a little faster, which thanks to everybody here, I really appreciate it. At some point, I'll probably end up having to resort to polls and things, but for now, just leave me a comment, say I'd like to see more on Russia, or I'd like to see something on any other country in the world or any other time period. I'm also willing to go off script into archaeology, paleontology, geology. Those are areas I know quite a bit about. You suggested, I'll see what I can do. So anyway, until we get this series over, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time for the final episode of The Great Northern War.